Welcome to another episode of Divorce Explained with myself, Leanne Townsend, and my colleague, Steve Benmor. We are family law lawyers, mediators, parenting coordinators, and we are here to provide you with some helpful information as you go through your separation and divorce. Now, today we have a topic that comes up with any parents, particularly those of older children who are perhaps going away to college or university. And that is the question of how does summer break affect child support? And it affects not only families, as I mentioned, that have college or university age students, but also the regular schedule often doesn't get followed during the summer break. Each parent may have additional parenting time. They may have the children for 2 weeks or potentially more. And so people often ask, and I'm going to put it over to you, Steve, how does that summer break and changes in schedule affect child support for our clients?
It's a very good question. And I wish, for the benefit of our viewers, that there was one definitive answer that applies to all situations. And although we lawyers are really good with the phraseology, it depends. This is one of those situations, but I'm going to do better than that. I'm going to actually create the decision tree or the silos that will help. First of all, let's just start with the assumption that when we talk about the summer break, there's two kinds of summer breaks. There's the summer break for kids that are in university, which generally means May, June, July, and August. And then there's the other summer break for the kids that are in day school, which is generally July and August, and sometimes a little bit of June. So those right away is another example of it depends. Now, under Ontario and federal Canadian law, table child support for children under the age of 18 is different than for children 18 and older. That's another it depends. The third it depends is where are the children living, whether they are under 18 or over 18. Are they living with each parent equally, both during the year and in the summer? Or are they living with only one parent? Or if they're a university child, are they even living at home with either parent? And so all of these are the quote unquote, it depends. So let's just start with the easiest one. Children under the age of 18, living with one parent throughout the year, and then that child or children continue living with that same parent throughout the summer months. Answer, usually the table child support from September to May continues all the way through June, July, and August. But what happens if in that scenario, that child is going 50-50 between both homes? And what if they decide that for the month of July, the child will stay with one parent, and for the month of August, the child will stay with the other parent? That's a situation where a judge may very well say no child support when the child is living with one parent, meaning the parent that is the resident parent collects child support, and the parent on the second month may not pay it because the child is with them. For example, that's a situation where one pays the other. Now, what happens in a situation where the children are over the age of 18? Well, now we get us into a situation where the law says table child support is not mandatory. So we're looking at a different situation altogether, and especially where the children are maybe traveling or living together in the same house that they were living in during the school year at student residence, but now they're working in the summer. So we've got a number of different scenarios. And of course, I can't answer every scenario because it gets even more complicated than that. What happens if you've got 3 children and one of them is going back and forth and one of them is in university and the other one is living with one parent permanently? So you get into these very, very complicated permutations that make it very difficult. And so at the end of the day, it's one of the reasons why I love mediation, because in mediation, I could throw out the hard and fast rules and I could curate a solution that makes most sense for that family, for that summer, with that allocation of where the children are living throughout the summer. So, for example, if the kid is staying at Queens for the summer and working summer, well, there might be a different solution than paying table child support, given the fact that the child might be able to make some of their cost of living, but need some assistance. Or there might be transportation costs, or there might be cell phone costs. So there are ways to resolve the question of how does summer break affect child support in a way that's, quite frankly, specific to that family.
Yeah, and it can be, as you just touched on, Steve, it can be very complicated because when there are more than one child in a family and different ones are, some are staying out of town in the summer. They're staying, for using the example of Queens, they're staying in Kingston and working. And then another child, perhaps goes to McGill and comes home and lives with one or both of the parents during the summer. Or you have children who go to school in town. So there's obviously university and college students who go to school here in Toronto and live at home during the whole year. They don't even go into residence. And so, that could be another permutation on how child support might look. And in my experience, whenever we're dealing with anything in family law, and particularly support issues, simplicity is always ideal. Complicated formulas and complicated calculations or provisions are, always problematic because they give rise to misinterpretation or misunderstanding and disagreement. So the more simple these things can be drafted, the more simply, the better. And as Steve touched upon, mediation is a great way to iron out these types of things, or working even with a parenting coordinator. And perhaps your children were younger when you initially did your parenting plan, and now they are of college, university age, and you need some updating, and working that type of stuff out with a parenting coordinator could also be a cost-effective step that's really helpful.
Now, I do want to say there are some typical scenarios that do apply where it is a university child. So let's just make an example. Jack and Diane, their daughter, Angela, when she is in town, she lives with her mom. So, during the school year, she lives with her mom. And in the summer months, she lives with her mom. And so in a situation like that, it would not be uncommon for the child support to stop for the months that she is away at university. So for example, September till the end of April. And then for the months of May to August, for Jack to pay Diane table child support for those 4 months. And so there are cases that have stood for the proposition that you take the 4 months, you add it up, you divide it by 12, and you pay that to Diane for each of the 12 months, which is really 4 months spilled over 12 months. There are other cases where they have said, no, Jack is paying his proportionate share of residence and school expenses for Angela during the school year. And in the summer months, if Angela is living with her mom for 3 months, Jack will pay child support, the full table amount for those 3 months. And if one of those 3 months, Angela is traveling or staying with dad, or maybe vacationing with dad on a trip or whatnot, then no child support would be paid there. So for example, if Jack would normally pay table child support of $1,500 a month for Angela, he may not be paying that $1,500 a month for the 8 months. He might pay it for 3 months. And in that 4th month, Jack doesn't pay the $1,500 because Angela's either with him or traveling or whatnot. And so that is a more customary approach to the university kid. One child lives away, comes home, and so forth. Now, one would say, well, hold on a second. What about the fact that Angela comes home for the 8 months? So there's Christmas, there's reading week, there's long weekends. So in that situation, some people have negotiated that instead of it being 4 months of table child support, they add 1 more month. You add 1 more month, to address those little snippets of extra time during the 8 months. So if you take 5 months and you divide that by 12 months, then some have found that to be equitable and provide parity so that Diane can maintain all of the expenses on her home and afford to give Angela a place to crash during the school year and, of course, in the summer months.
Yeah, and certainly in situations where there's perhaps one child who is university, college age and going out of town for school, but coming home in the summer, and there's a younger child who is at home still full time, doing the annualized monthly approach can be more desirable because you're already paying the monthly child support for the child who's under 18 and at home. So adding a smaller amount on as an adjustment for the older child who is away at school, that can make sense because the payor is already paying that each month anyway. But in a situation where there perhaps is just one child or both children are away at university, for what I've more commonly seen is the approach that Steve just outlined, where it's just paid for, either 3 months or 4 months or 5 months, depending on what the appropriate adjustment is for that specific family.
Now, I also want to not allow things to get too simple, so I'm going to make things slightly more complicated. When the child support changes, for those families where spousal support is paid periodically, it therefore affects that. So for those that don't know, there are two types of support. There's child support and spousal support. And so when we do calculations to determine what Jack pays Diane in spousal support, we first have to calculate what Jack pays Diane in child support. And then the leftover money is then used in order to allocate the numbers for the purposes of spousal support. For those that don't know, child support is tax-free. The recipient receives it without paying tax. The payor pays it without being able to deduct tax, whereas spousal support is taxable to the recipient and tax deductible to the payor. And so when we calculate child support and spousal support, and they often go together where there are cases involving spousal support and children, then we have to account for the fact that the decreasing amount in child support has a concomitant effect on periodic spousal support, meaning the spousal support would often go up when we calculate a lower amount in child support. And that's where a child who might be 16 years old when the couple breaks up, and the couple would have had a spousal and child support arrangement, 2 years later, things are very different because now the child's away at school 8 months a year, and the spousal support is still payable, the child support is still payable, but the numbers are all very different. So I just wanted to point out that there are a number of different cause and effect situations when it comes to child and spousal support. Now, the other thing that needs to be considered is that Section 7 expenses have to sit into this somewhere as well. So what are Section 7 expenses? Those are enumerated expenses such as programs for children who are minors, healthcare costs, dental costs, private school costs, and for children that are 18 and older, post-secondary university costs, healthcare costs, and so forth. And so those Section 7 expenses also fit into this analysis. Mm-hmm. So for example, there could be, with minor children that go to overnight camp. Well, overnight camp is expensive. And so there are families that will spend per child $10,000 to $15,000 a summer to send the child to overnight camp. And so what does that do to table child support? Oftentimes, where the child goes to sleepover camp, that's considered a Section 7 expense proportionally split between the two parents. And when that happens, oftentimes we see that no table child support is paid for the very same period that the child is away at overnight camp. And of course, that would apply equally with kids over the age of 18 who are not staying in Toronto or with their families at home.
And tied in with that point as well is that Section 7 expenses can potentially affect spousal support, in that if one party agrees to pay perhaps a disproportionate amount of Section 7 expenses, like for, say, one parent says they'll pay for the university education of the child in full rather than asking that the other spouse pay their proportionate share, then that could potentially affect the amount of spousal support that the recipient parent would be receiving, because now that person is not having to contribute towards the Section 7 expense. So there's all kinds of different formulas that come up. And with these issues, it's always important to get legal advice for that very reason, because it's not just black and white. And I find often I come across clients and they think that because we're dealing with the law, that it should just be black and white. Well, they'll say to me, well, what is the law? But I always say that if the law was black and white, we wouldn't need lawyers, because it would be that clear. And often these things that, there are some things where there's hard and fast rules, and there's some things where there aren't. And how summer break affects child support is a perfect example, because there are certain things where it is clear cut how the support will be managed. And in other situations, there's different models for what can happen. And it's a matter of figuring out the best solution for that particular family.
Right. And so, I end with how I started, which is child support is the money that is paid by one parent to the other in order to provide a roof, food, and accommodations to a child that's living with them. If a child is living with two parents, money goes back and forth. If the child is living with one parent, money goes in one direction. And depending on the age of the child, depending on what the child is doing in the summer, the issue of child support can very much vary depending on the situation at hand. And you're correct, Leanne, as you say, it's a situation that definitely merits getting at least some basic legal advice, whether that means to review a separation agreement or a court order and to explain to the person who is bound by it how that affects them, or possibly to seek a variation to the separation agreement or court order based on changes that have occurred from the time that it was originally made. And the reason I say that is because a lot of people forget that child support is oftentimes enforced by a government agency called the Family Responsibility Office. And even though the parents themselves might agree that child support should not be paid for the month of July or the month of August, well, the government agency will still enforce it against their income, or potentially against through garnishment proceedings. So it's absolutely important to do this, not just by a handshake with your ex-spouse, but to do it in such a way that involves the variation and the signed documentation surrounding the changes to the support arrangement that was pre-existing. So a lot said.